Residential school experiments. You may have recently heard of the residential schools in the US and Canada, made to assimilate and systematically extinguish the Native American, led by Christian missionaries, and the last one closed in the mid-90s. While some kids were listening to the Macarena, Boombastic, and Gangsta's Paradise, even more sinister acts had been committed in secrecy, like nutrition deficiency experiments. Instead of using paid participants, giving Native kids only 1,000 calories a day to see how it would affect them. Kids were refused any food with iron and vitamin C to document how they deteriorated. Most of these kids couldn't survive lacking vital nutrients, giving us the unmarked graves. While your typical meal would be porridge and cornflakes, and occasionally rotten onion soup, terribly spoiled meat would be added to watch the effects of disease, usually served as frozen beef chunks or rotten fish sticks. And if you didn't eat it, the meal would be held until you did. Medical experiments could include things like measuring pain tolerance, withholding dental treatment, sterilization methods, giving and testing drugs on kids to watch for horrible side effects. And though the last one did close in 1996, Native siblings, parents, grandparents still live with the after effects. And if you're aware of how effective systematic torture is, finding this info from the source of the survivor is nearly impossible. Who is Poo Devourer? The self-proclaimed scat lord. And if you haven't got the hint yet, and you hate poop, leave now. Poo Devourer has recently been brought to the foreground of Reddit's r/Playboy Cardi from 17-year-old producer Lyoko's DM interview. Mr. Poo, who was actually diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar, started developing auditory hallucinations that would argue with him and try and get him to eat his own feces, which he ignored until he entered a state of psychosis. And in this state, he said they took control of him, and that's when he started eating his own poop, and heavily at that, consuming it at least once per day for almost half a year, which was something he had pretty much zero control over. But after receiving medical treatment for his psychosis, he hasn't been in that state, yet still consumes his own excrement, and not only that, but gets immense pleasure from this, which is actually called coprophilia. And he's actually consumed the feces of 3 other women, but usually when he tells his partner about this, they leave him. He claimed eating his own poo is perfectly safe, and eating others is dangerous because of pathogens, yet he does it anyways because it's totally worth it. And on the tail end of things, he said if he could tell the world anything about people like him, is that they don't harm anyone, or anything, and would just like to be recognized and respected. The Butcher of Uganda. His real name was Idi Amin, but his nickname was much more appropriate, seeing as he was directly responsible for over 300,000 deaths. He was a military officer until he found out the president was planning to arrest him, so he launched a military coup and declared he was the new president. In the first year of rule, he killed over 5,000 people, and that was his slowest year, but his nickname came from his style of execution. He didn't kill them, and neither did his troops kill him. Whether it be a school, or a household, or an ethnic group, it didn't matter. They were made to line up, and the second person in line was given a hammer. That person would be ordered to hit the first person in line over the head with the hammer until they were dead. And once they were, they passed the hammer to the person behind him, and they'd be bludgeoned to death themselves. Repeat until everyone's dead. And the butcher loved to watch, so when he was there, the process included a machete, and nobody wanted to die like this. Not even his troops. So many of them fled to Tanzania, where Amin waged war, and lost. So he was forced to flee himself to Saudi Arabia. Idi Amin, the man who chopped off his wife's limbs, ate his own people, stored heads in a freezer, and tortured hundreds of thousands of people, lived comfortably in Saudi Arabia until 2003, where he fell into a coma and passed away peacefully in his sleep from old age. Time out. Commercial break. Only 7% of you guys are subscribed. Help me change that. 92.4 of you guys subscribe right now while you're watching the video. That way you never miss one of these. Honor killing. The act of killing someone or oneself to save dignity and honor. In Japan, and also to a wider extent, most Asian countries would call this saving face. Face is nearly everything. Though to each culture, face holds its own different attributes. Everyone holds a certain amount of face, and as so, you abide by the unwritten rules. Losing face could be something like someone disagreeing with you and embarrassing you, but we can also see it in these actions. Losing enough face leads to the honor killings, and the history of death and honor are intertwined, like the famed act of seppuku, which was in the samurai code of honor, and is voluntarily disemboweling oneself with a sword rather than fall into the enemy's hands, and you can see how that would be honorable. But later, it turned into commoners committing the same act to save honor amongst themselves. In World War II, we saw kamikaze pilots, one of the most honorable acts for a low-ranking soldier. But today, as we live in the most safe and peaceful time in history, honor killings persist and are committed by parents of failing students, kids with depression, people feeling like they brought shame to their family, and also probably contributes to the more than 100,000 people that go missing in Japan every year. These romanticized views of killing oneself for honor or love or any reason also leaves Japan with the highest rate of attempts in all of Asia, what's become by far the most overdiagnosed disorder. While today, ADHD stands as a diagnosis and is seen as negative, it used to have its evolutionary advantages. Until 12,000 years ago, nearly every human on Earth was a hunter or a gatherer. The unpredictability and the energy-inducing effects of ADHD could help these people fend off village raids, with them being rewarded with the extra reproductive benefits. Ooh ah, booty. Totally worth it. One thing you may not know is many people with ADHD actually work best under pressure. Revving their brains up has the opposite effect, helping them make the clearest decisions and having the most level head in dire circumstances. Being easily distracted when heavily focused, like trying to catch a meal, meanwhile, you're the only one that sees a giant hyena blink his eyes while he's trying to hunt you in the meantime, keeping yourself and your village members alive. Ooh ah, booty. Even the trouble sleeping we see in up to 50% of people with ADHD had their place. In the past, humans never slept through the night. You're supposed to be sleeping twice a night, waking up for 2 to 3 hours in between, but if everyone's sleeping through the night like they did now, who's watching out for the hyenas? Humans had staggered sleep patterns. People with ADHD would stay up until the first sleep of the normal humans was over. How could they ever repay them? Ooh. The gray area. Everyone has to follow the laws or suffer the consequences, unless you're rich or just really don't want to. The gray area of laws allow for loopholes, kind of like billionaires not having to pay all their taxes. Some people want steroids, but without the chance of spending a year in prison, so they opt for SARMs instead. And because the law is against anabolics and not selective androgen receptors, these are legal to sell. The gray area? They're legal to sell as long as it's not for human consumption. But come on though, you think this guy is just buying them to run tests on plant growth? Speaking of plants, Mitragina speciosa, known better as kratom, and its relation to the opioid crisis. Opioids are illegal to take without a prescription, but the kratom leaf contains mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine. Opioids are anything that act on opioid receptors, and despite what some people will have you think, both of these act on the opioid receptors, and is federally legal, but do have restrictions or are illegal in these states. The unforeseen upside to this is it's helped people addicted to harder substances wean themselves off of it, and it's far less likely for extreme abuse, since taking higher doses can make you extremely sick. Seriously, liquid will explode out of all your holes. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because the US has a gray area for everything. Bigorexia. Online this topic has come about in a big way, but for your short answer, no, it's not. But that doesn't mean it's not something else. Bigorexia is more of a slang term, and is the idea of young men usually looking up to men on gear and being very unsatisfied with their own body. It's called muscle dysmorphia, or MD. And if you can't tell by the name, is a type of body dysmorphic disorder. And while in women the most common ED is bulimia, in men, MD affects 2.4% of the population. But some research has said it's possibly a lot higher than that. But because unraveling, revealing, and even acknowledging these feelings is taboo in Western society, most men's knee-jerk reaction to this topic is so hard, they aren't even able to admit this is occurring in themselves, which really does not help, seeing as the first step to curbing these OCD-like and uncontrolled negative thoughts, since men and boys on a normal basis think they should naturally look like this, when without gear is unobtainable, and as most usually don't admit, unhealthy. Getting in good shape is one thing. Making the decision to get big enough you're past your heart's healthy limit is another. But not being honest about how you did it, hiding the health risks that are included, and acting like men used to look like this, are supposed to look like this, or are most healthy when they do look like this, is just a lie. 5 interesting stuff. Number 5. Snakes hatch from eggs, which sounds kinda gross when you say it out loud for some reason, but not as gross as snakes that actually have live birth. I'm sorry ma'am, your child looks like a deadly parasite. Number 4. This is the largest clear-cut diamond in the world. It's called the Great Star of Africa because it was found in Africa in 1905. It's worth about $500 million, and the evil queen, Queen Elizabeth II owns it. Number 3. And speaking of Africa, the African lungfish that actually breathes air, walks, and survives without water for over a year. He sounds weird, but he's actually more perfect than your slowly evolving unfinished judgment of where were we again? Oh yeah, for the past 400 million years, whenever this guy's stream dries up, he just covers himself in mucus, leaves a hole for him to breathe through, and waits for the rain to return. If you didn't have water, you'd probably die in like a week. Number 2. Some traffic jams in India are unexplainable, and I don't plan to explain them. And number 1. The reason you gotta be on time to class, the Egyptians. They made the oldest timekeeping device and passed it around the world like a bad case of the herpes, forcing the rest of us chumps to believe in their made-up time. Well, I'm not buying it. They can take their oldest whatever and shove it where the raw don't shine, because waking up with an alarm is a scam, and so is Wyoming. King James. Yes, that King James had a dirty little secret. Like most notable figures who were in the past, and covered up by the preceding generations, this man was gay. Well, he was bi, because he married Anne of Denmark, who while Ad was 14 when she married James, who was already in his mid-20s, and he cheated on her with another hoochie named Anne, the poem, and a dream on his mistress Lady Glamis, writing, "My mistress and my love," but only married Anne of Denmark after his first lover died, Esme Stuart, his second cousin, who didn't know James fell in love with him until a year after, at 14, whose great love was above all others. During this time, he was praised for his celibacy, since he didn't show any interest in women. Yet, in front of these same people, these two would hold each other and even kiss each other, and the nobles didn't like that. So they locked James up for a year and made him banish Esme, which sucks for him because he left his family too, and then he suspiciously died. Skipping forward again to his marriage, which he also had 8 kids in, during 1606, it got rocky, and they decided not to live together. So that's when 17-year-old Robert Carr started hooking up with James, who was now in his 40s. He fell in love and gave him so many gifts, he ended up rich, including a well-documented and huge monthly allowance for clothes, until Robert started creeping back and withdrawing himself from lying in his chamber. So he sentenced him to death, and then changed it to 7 years in prison, and then changed it to banishment, but to a paid house on the country estate. So then he fell in love with George Villiers, a commoner he made a duke, and wrote this. I can't read it because of time, but pause and do so because it's a little spicy considering it's a biblical translation. And they may have also had a secret three-way marriage with Anne of Duke. She wrote spicy letters to him, and James wrote spicy letters calling George his wife, even reminiscing, and I'm paraphrasing here, at Farnham when they were hanging out and had 0 space between each other in the bed. Just seems a bit weird considering he wrote the Basilican Doran that says, "Sodomy among ye are bound and conscious never to forgive." He wrote that here, so I don't really think he had a change of heart. On the gay meter, he was about a 5, because he was definitely happily swinging both ways. And on the king meter, I put him at a 6.9. Not the best, not the worst.